It is just after midnight on September 22nd, 1988. Eugene "Bull" Hairston is standing outside the Ida B. Wells public housing complex on Chicago's South Side. He is not alone but has a backup man walking close to him, someone whose specific job was to travel with Hairston and watch for threats. By 1988, Hairston was the kind of man who needed someone to watch for threats because he had been that kind of man to cause trouble for most of his adult life. Then a third man appears on the street and walks toward them, and soon shots are fired. The backup man crosses to the other side. Eugene Hairston sustained multiple critical gunshot wounds across his body. By the time emergency crews brought him through the doors of Michael Reese Hospital, there is nothing left to do. It is 12:30 in the morning, and Eugene Hairston, 44 years old, is dead on arrival. Officers arriving at the scene find a black leather cap, a jacket, a 9mm handgun, and a .357 Magnum revolver tossed in a vacant lot at Oakwood Boulevard and Vincennes Avenue. But the two shooters are long gone. No arrests are ever made. The case is never closed, and the murder of Eugene "Bull" Hairston remains unsolved to this day. At El Rukina headquarters on 3947 S. Drexel Avenue, in a converted theater that the organization had taken over in 1977 and transformed into its base of operations, a man who identified himself as a commander went before reporters and said that Hairston had been in good standing with the tribe, that the El Rukins mourned him, but that Hairston had not been a member because he could not comply with requirements like avoiding profanity and alcohol. The commander said Ibrahim had his own ideas of what he wanted to do. Ibrahim was Hairston's Muslim name, given to him in the years when the organization was converting, before he rejected the conversion and was expelled from the nation he had helped found. That morning, jury selection began in the federal murder trial of Jeff Fort, already serving an 80-year sentence for conspiracy to commit terrorist acts for the Libyan government. Fort stood accused of ordering the 1981 killing of a rival gang figure. Police said the motive for Hairston's death may be connected to Jeff Fort, that Fort had issued an order and Hairston had refused it. As with everything involving these two men by that point, the truth was not simple and the evidence was not conclusive. What is conclusive, what the court records, the Senate hearings, the newspaper archives, and the gang histories all agree on, is this: Eugene "Bull" Hairston co-founded the Blackstone Rangers with Jeff Fort. He held the title of president. He built the organizational structure that made the Rangers a functioning body rather than a loose collection of fighting teenagers. He set rules, enforced discipline, appointed leadership, and held the Constitution of the Maine 21 in his hands before Fort was ready to do any of those things publicly. He was the big chief before Fort became the chief. And then, through a combination of a criminal conviction, a hostile takeover, an assassination attempt, and years of slow displacement, he lost everything, while the organization he helped build grew into one of the largest street organizations in American history. This is not Fort's story. Fort's story has been told. The Senate hearings, the OEO money, the Libya trial, the 80-year sentence. This is the story the title names: the man who built the Black Pea Stones with Jeff Fort, what he built, how he lost it, and what that loss looked like from the inside. Now let's pull back from that alley and return to where it started. The neighborhood and the two boys, 1944 to 1959. To understand Eugene Hairston, you have to understand Woodlawn in the 1950s. And to understand Woodlawn, you have to understand the mechanisms that created it. Restrictive covenants, legal agreements that prohibited the sale of homes to black families, had kept Chicago's South Side neighborhoods segregated for decades. When the Supreme Court ruled those covenants unenforceable in 1948, black families began moving into previously all-white neighborhoods in large numbers. The response from white communities and real estate markets was a practice called blockbusting. Agents approached white homeowners, told them black families were moving in, bought the properties cheap, and resold them to black buyers at inflated prices. Banks simultaneously redlined these communities, flagging them as too risky for investment, denying mortgages and small business loans, cutting off the capital that would have allowed residents to maintain and improve what they owned. By the early 1960s, roughly 80,000 people were crammed into Woodlawn housing designed for 40,000. Landlords illegally subdivided apartments into single-room kitchenette units and charged more per square foot than elsewhere in the city. Schools buckled, businesses left, streets deteriorated, and by 1959, almost 90% of the white population had abandoned Woodlawn, leaving behind extreme blight and the abandonment of businesses and properties. The physical collapse coincided with the arrival of two gangs from further north. The Devil's Disciples and the Egyptian Cobras moved into Woodlawn in 1958, initially to offer protection to a black community being subjected to brutal policing and rising street crime. Within months, the two gangs were fighting each other for territory. In East Woodlawn, the Cobras dominated. The neighborhood was divided, contested, and unpoliced by any authority that the people living in it trusted. As one historical account puts it, between 1958 and 1964, Woodlawn changed from white to black and doubled in size, with 80,000 people crammed into houses meant for 40,000. Suddenly, there were 7 times as many children as before, and turf, any turf, became their overriding passion. Overgrown lots became gang turf. Small groups of teenagers armed with bats and broken bottles patrolled corners. In the vacuum of decaying order, youth gangs organized for mutual protection and identity. Eugene Hairston was born on May 1st, 1944, in Columbus, Ohio. He was not a native of Chicago. His family moved to the city in 1955, first settling on the Low End, the east side of Washington Park in the Grand Boulevard neighborhood. In 1956, the Hairston family relocated to Woodlawn, near Stony Island Avenue. The Hairstons came from a more middle-class background than many of the families flooding into these neighborhoods, not wealthy, but with more stability than most. Eugene was not a gang member before 1959. He was not even a native of the city, but Woodlawn worked on him quickly. He connected with neighborhood pimps, hustlers, drug peddlers, and gamblers after the move, and that contact gave him something that would define the rest of his life: charisma and the ability to earn respect on the street. The nickname Bull came in those Woodlawn years. It would eventually grow into King Bull. Where it came from, what the word was meant to describe, no surviving record explains. The Fort family arrived through a different path entirely. John and Annie Fort were cotton pickers from Aberdeen, Mississippi, part of the Great Migration that brought hundreds of thousands of black Southerners into northern cities across the 1940s and 1950s. The Forts first lived near 22nd and Cottage Grove in 1955, then relocated to Woodlawn in 1956 after construction projects removed Cottage Grove Avenue from 22nd down to 33rd Street. They settled at 6536 Blackstone Avenue, at the corner of 65th Place and Blackstone, both families in Woodlawn the same year. The Hairstons and the Forts made contact and bonded. Through that connection, Eugene Hairston and Jeff Fort, born February 20th, 1947, 3 years younger than Hairston, became friends. In those early years, Fort was in Hairston's shadow. He was 9 years old when Hairston was 12. The Vice Lords are a piece of this that cannot be skipped. Leonard Cal Calloway was one of the first 7 Vice Lords and a relative of Eugene Hairston. Before he was a Vice Lord, Cal had been an Imperial chaplain. As the Vice Lords grew in North Lawndale on the west side, Fort, who had behavioral problems at home and at school, and who sometimes ran away to stay on the west side with Cal, watched how Cal and the others were plotting strategy for taking over North Lawndale. This is how Fort and Hairston learned how to be conquerors and gang leaders from the original Vice Lords. They also learned how to draw up a constitution and create bylaws for the organization to follow, and how to set and enforce rules. Both absorbed that model at different speeds and in different registers. Fort had behavioral problems as a child. He got in trouble repeatedly at school and at home. Sometimes he would run away to the west side and stay over by Cal, and this is when he personally witnessed the rise of the Vice Lords and how they were plotting strategy. The street pulled at him early. He was never able to stay in the civilian world for long. In November 1959, Jeff Fort assembled the Blackstone Rangers. He was 12 years old. He named them after the street he lived on. His claimed turf ran from 64th to 66th Street along Blackstone Avenue. In the beginning, Rangers were said to be thieves who stole purses and broke into stores. They also fought battles with the much larger Egyptian Cobras. At the same time, Eugene Hairston, now 15, started his own group. He called it the Harper's Boys, after the block between 63rd and 64th and Harper. The Harper's Boys claimed territory from 63rd down to 67th along Stony Island Avenue, centered on Jackson Park. Both groups were roughly a dozen strong. Both drew from the same pool of Woodlawn youth. Both had been shaped by the Vice Lord's template, and the moment each had their own organization, they were at war with each other. The merger, the syndicates, and the structure, 1960 to 1964. Through 1960, The Rangers and the Harper's Boys fought each other alongside their shared conflicts against the Egyptian Cobras and the Devil's Disciples. Neither group was able to defeat the other. The violence did not resolve the territorial question. What it produced instead was stalemate, and one incident that pushed the stalemate into something more serious. The Rangers shot a Harper's Boy named Carl Robinson with a zip gun. The Harper's Boys' fury at that act pushed the rivalry into something deeper and harder to walk back, but the stalemate held. Neither side could break through. Fort's group gained more public recognition. The Blackstone Rangers were reported in newspapers and watched by authorities more closely, while the Harper's Boys were sometimes just referred to as Rangers by people who could not track the distinction. The Blackstone name had more gravity, for reasons partly of geography and partly of timing. By the middle of 1960, the arithmetic was clear. Fort and Hairston realized they could not defeat each other. They combined forces as one organization. The name question was settled without ceremony. Hairston did not like the name Blackstone Rangers. He accepted it because it was the name the street already recognized, but the merger alone did not make them what they became. The structure came from somewhere else. Hairston had connections to adult African American syndicate groups operating across the neighborhood, men who ran numbers games, drug distribution, prostitution, gambling dens, and worked as fences for stolen goods. These were not the Italian outfit directly. They were local black criminal organizations, some of which had their own relationships with outfit-connected figures, which gave them access to larger markets and some institutional protection from the police. These syndicates saw how the Rangers could be vicious and how they had influence on the streets of Woodlawn, and they saw opportunity. The syndicates needed people to move product, collect extortion payments, intimidate uncooperative parties, and when the situation required it, to kill. They needed people young enough that if they were caught, the legal consequences would be manageable. Boys under 17 faced juvenile detention rather than adult prison time. Adults would have faced serious sentences. Most times the boys were paid just a few coins, and of course the best part was the older guys didn't do jail time. The syndicates installed a no snitching policy backed by threats and mentored the boys on how to grow, how to recruit, how to expand while remaining useful. The syndicates appointed Eugene Hairston as head of the combined organization, giving him the title of Big Chief. The decision was not democratic. Hairston was chosen for his charisma, his street reputation, and his capacity to control men. Fort was appointed Little Chief with a specific function: recruitment. Fort could draw young men in. He was charismatic in a different register from Hairston, more capable of navigating between the street world and the institutional world beginning to form around them. From that structure, the Rangers grew. Hairston had the ability to relate to leaders of other gangs in the neighborhood and convince them to take their whole gang and join the Rangers. This is when the Rangers really started to grow in 1960. Gang by gang, block by block, the Rangers absorbed competing groups. The constitutional framework came from the Vice Lord's template Fort had observed. The main 21 ruling body was created, a set of bylaws and a constitution the Rangers had to live by, written by Hairston, Lamar Bop Daddy Bell, Charles Rico Cranshaw, and other former Harper's Boys. The Vice Lords were named first cousins, partly through actual family ties via Cal Calloway. The pyramid was chosen as the central symbol, representing ancient Egypt as the first civilization, and by extension the African origins of human civilization. In 1961, both Fort and Hairston were locked up in a juvenile detention center. The Rangers continued under interim leadership. Charles Bear Edward Bay held things together. Both were released in 1962. That same year, the Rangers received their first structural expansion through conversion. The Egyptian Cobras were brought into the Blackstone Rangers as King Cobra Stones. Mickey Cogwell took leadership of this new formation. This move put Ranger presence into the Robert Taylor projects and opened a path into Inglewood. Between 1962 and 1964, the Rangers grew into the hundreds, pulling in gang after gang across the South Side. By 1964, the Rangers were operating in South Shore, Greater Grand Crossing, Auburn Gresham, Chatham, Roseland, Washington Heights, and into the south suburbs: Harvey, Dixmoor, Phoenix, Robbins, Fort Heights, Chicago Heights, and Markham. Each expansion followed a recognizable pattern: a community under racial pressure, white flight accelerating, young black men facing violence from white gangs or total neglect from public institutions, and the Rangers arriving with structure, identity, protection, and belonging. The money in these years came from taxing drug dealers, pimps, gambling houses, and local businesses in exchange for protection. Rangers visited stores and taxed store owners in exchange for protection from rival gangs or other criminals. In Woodlawn and its neighboring communities, where police patrols were scarce and violent crime against businesses was constant, paying the Rangers was often cheaper than the alternative. Stones placed signs on protected businesses displaying the pyramid. The message was clear. Examples were made publicly of anyone who touched a marked store. Stones would always send different young boys to collect the money. Never the same faces, often members from outside the neighborhood whose faces were not as recognized. The operation was disciplined from the start. What the protection scheme also did, and this is the part that tends to get lost, was regulate who operated in these communities and how. Before the Rangers controlled the rackets, outside forces came in and caused damage. When white customers came into the neighborhood seeking drugs and prostitutes, they often became crime victims. And because the victim was white, police would sweep the area and crack heads of black men who had nothing to do with the original crime. The Rangers put a stop to this by keeping outsiders out, particularly cutting off the white syndicate-connected pimps and drug distributors who had been running operations in Woodlawn without paying any tribute to the community's own power structure. By bringing those operations under Ranger control, Hairston and Fort were doing something the police could not or would not do, creating order in a community that the city had officially abandoned. Stones often left black-owned businesses alone and would protect them for free. Jewish-owned businesses, which tended to charge higher prices and were seen as extracting money from the community, were the primary targets for the protection tax. This was not random. It reflected a coherent, if coercive, political economy. Resources should flow within the community, not out of it. The South suburban expansion of 1964 deserves specific attention because it shows how far the organizational reach extended within the Rangers' first 5 years. In August 1964, the gin bottle riots erupted in Dixmoor, a suburb that had long been majority black, when a racial dispute at a liquor store sparked a massive confrontation. During the unrest, the Black P. Stones arrived and recruited, starting the Harvey Dixmoor Rangers. In Harvey, Stones were the first Chicago gang to settle those streets, likely starting in 1964 as block busting and white flight were changing the suburb's demographics. In Robbins, the chapter was personally blessed by Hairston, founded by William Harper, an original member of the Harper's Boys, which meant it traced directly back to Hairston's first gang. The man who gave Robbins its chapter was one of Hairston's original men, and Hairston's blessing was required. That detail, small as it seems, shows exactly where authority sat in those years, with Hairston. In 1964, Jeff Fort's adult criminal record began when he was jailed briefly for robbery. He was 17 years old. The system had started keeping a formal file on him. By 1965, two contradictory forces operated around the Rangers. On one side, criminal organization, syndicate money, territorial warfare, and the use of young boys for violence. On the other, growing relationships with churches, community organizations, and eventually the federal government, all believing the Rangers could be channeled into something productive. In April 1965, Ed Woods of the Woodlawn Chicago Boys Club and Reverend O.H. Wilson Sotnak of Woodlawn Emmanuel Lutheran Church at 64th and Kenwood offered their facilities 3 days a week. Basketball, pool, card games, ping pong, and checkers to keep Rangers off the streets. The Rangers organized dances and raised money. Woods worked directly with Fort and Hairston on job placement. For young men in Woodlawn, where the local economy had collapsed and legitimate employment was nearly unreachable, this mattered. The church connection also gave the organization new institutional credibility. That same year, Fort connected with Reverend John Fry of the First Presbyterian Church at 64th and Kimbark. Fry opened his church as a base of operations, meeting space, and social center. He wanted the Rangers transformed from a street gang into a community-based organization. He worked primarily with Fort, the public face and negotiator, while Hairston remained more behind the scenes. This distinction between Fort's external visibility and Hairston's internal authority would grow more consequential. The church worked with the Woodlawn Organization, TWO, a Saul Alinsky-style coalition led by Reverend Arthur Brazier that ran Head Start and adult job training. The Rangers were folded in. Several went on payroll for attending meetings and guiding neighborhood youth. They could now afford bush-top fades and Converse shoes, wore khakis and white t-shirts, and set neighborhood fashion trends. Kids who had not considered joining wanted in. By 1965, the Rangers had 200 members on record, with hundreds more across the city unaccounted for. In December 1966, Fort proposed to Hairston that the Federation take a new name. the Black Peace Stone Nation, or Black Peace Stone Nation, drawn from Islamic teachings about the Black Stone of Mecca, believed to have come from heaven through the Archangel Gabriel and housed in the Kaaba. Fort had been reading Islamic teachings for years. The name gave the organization historical and spiritual weight beyond Chicago's South Side. Hairston agreed. The Rangers became Stones. Membership expanded rapidly through 1966 as the Confederation pulled in gangs from Inglewood, West Inglewood, Grand Boulevard, the near South Side, Oakland, Kenwood, and Cabrini Green. By 1966, it reached 1,500 documented members, as far north as 31st Street, with thousands more unaccounted for. The Stones connected with the Black nationalist movement. When Martin Luther King came to Chicago, hundreds of Rangers marched at a Soldier Field rally and later alongside King after SCLC nonviolence workshops. Hairston aligned especially with the Black Power dimension. He encouraged Afros to show Black pride and oppose narcotics, both personal use and trafficking. His personal vices were marijuana and alcohol. Fort did not drink, use drugs, or curse. Both men carried themselves as leaders of something larger than a street gang and were treated that way by Chicago's institutions for a time. In spring 1967, TWO received $927,000 from the U.S. Office of Economic Opportunity under Johnson's War on Poverty to fund a youth job training program in Woodlawn using the existing gang structure. Half went to the Rangers, half to the Disciples. Both were to oversee training centers and act as instructors. Jeff Fort was paid $6,000 a year as center chief. Eugene Hairston $6,500 as assistant project director. The trainees received $45 a week. The structural flaw was immediate. Young men with no management training, some who had never held a job, were placed in charge of classrooms and payroll with no real oversight. Xerox wrote the curriculum. The Chicago Urban League handled job development, and Arthur Anderson provided monthly audits, but actual instruction was left to gang leaders, the program's own backers, called near illiterates but geniuses. That summer, the Rangers successfully prevented a Southside riot. Membership climbed to 3,000 documented members. At that moment, they looked like the constructive force their institutional partners wanted. Those partners had interests of their own. TWO, the churches, and the OEO needed to fund groups like the Rangers and Disciples to justify their budgets and institutional standing. Without the gang wars, they would have had far less justification for continued grants. The social service apparatus depended in a real sense on the problem it was supposed to solve. Law enforcement occupied a parallel position. The violence between Rangers and Disciples justified more resources and aggressive pursuit of both leaderships. There is evidence the FBI sent letters to gang leaders claiming the other side was about to move, an attempt to provoke mutual destruction. Hairston, Fort, and David Barksdale of the Disciples all understood a dirty game was being played and worked to maintain peace treaties even as law enforcement tried to undermine them. The Black nationalist connection added another dimension. Fort continued moving toward religious ideology. Hairston remained more grounded in community protection and economic control. In 1966, they were still aligned. That alignment would not last. In September 1967, Eugene Hairston was arrested. The conviction and the transfer of power, 1977 to 1969. The charge was solicitation to commit murder. 3 men were dealing drugs at 61st in Dorchester outside the Rangers' authorization and tax structure. The charge stated Hairston ordered boys aged 13 to 15 to carry out an assassination. 13-year-old Dennis Jackson approached a car with a .45 and fired 6 bullets. Leo McClure was killed, 2 others wounded. Before firing, Jackson reportedly said, "I hear you was messing with the chief." It was the same pattern the adult syndicates had used on the Rangers a decade earlier. Young boys for violent jobs because they received lighter sentences. Whether Hairston ordered this specific killing or the boys acted on their own and later implicated him could not be established definitively. The court resolved the ambiguity in only one direction. Prophet Paul Martin, the spiritual leader and Hairston's most loyal lieutenant, faced the same charges on the same evidence and was found not guilty. Hairston was convicted, sentenced to 15 years, and sent to Stateville. The total payment to the boys for the killing, according to court documents, was $6 split among them and a plate of food. With Hairston in custody, the OEO program deteriorated. Rangers falsified attendance sheets, took sign-in documents home, and fraudulently signed checks. Fort was also jailed in November 1967 on a murder charge, later acquitted, removing him at the same critical moment. Without either founder, the operation ran without direction. Investigations built slowly. In July 1968, Senator John McClellan held televised hearings on the $927,431 granted to TWO. Testimony came from George Watusi Rose, a former Ranger warlord the FBI had flipped. Rose alleged narcotics sales inside the program, kickbacks from trainees, guns in the Presbyterian church basement, and a meeting with white communists. Many of his specific claims, including the communist meeting, never happened. The committee did not verify them before presenting them publicly. Fort was subpoenaed. When questioning reached his address, his attorney advised silence. Fort stood, raised a clenched fist, and walked out. Cited for contempt of Congress, the gesture was filmed and replayed for years. What the hearings largely omitted, roughly $200,000 of the grant was returned unspent. Of the remainder, only about 33% went to the Rangers. The amount deposited into Fort's personal account was $1,467.79. The public narrative was simpler. Gang leaders had stolen federal money. Fort was released in March 1968 to an organization in serious disorder. A faction called the Imperial Lovers was near open rebellion. Fort assumed total control and pushed Hairston, still on trial, into a secondary position. Paul Martin, who opposed the consolidation, was led into an alley in 1969 and shot 3 times in the back of the head. Opposition was removed. Fort now commanded an army of 5,000 documented soldiers. He inherited the Constitution Hairston had written, the main 21 structure Hairston had built, the syndicate connections Hairston had cultivated, and the church and government relationships Hairston had helped establish. The organization Fort ran was the one Hairston had organized. In May 1968, Hairston's conviction was finalized. The following year, he went to prison and Fort inherited the 5,000-member confederation. Fort did not seize it by force. Hairston went to Stateville and Fort moved into the vacant seat. By 1969, with government funding gone and membership exceeding 6,000, Fort authorized the heroin trade, something Hairston had long opposed. First formal contacts with Italian outfit-connected figures were made through Mickey Cogwell and Rico Cranshaw. Fort, jailed that summer on a battery charge and needing $80,000 bail, sanctioned the arrangement. The organization Hairston had helped build as a community protection entity was now entering large-scale drug distribution. Hairston, in Stateville, watched it happen. Exile, the War for the Nation, and the End, 1971 to 1988. In April 1971, Fort faced charges of defrauding the federal government tied to the OEO investigation. Convicted in 1972, he was sentenced to 5 years and sent to Stateville and Crest Hill. For a period, both co-founders were imprisoned within miles of each other, Fort at Stateville, Hairston at Joliet. From separate cells, both tried to run an organization with tens of thousands of members. Fort ordered executions of main 21 members who showed disloyalty. Hairston moved to consolidate influence inside the prison system through a 1975 disturbance in which drugs were brought to him so he could control Joliet. 1 death resulted. Hairston was transferred to Menard in southern Illinois, far from his Chicago contacts. At Menard, he connected with Herbert Thunder Stevens, who had been given full control of Stateville by Fort before Fort's transfer. Stevens was one of the few who had maintained good standing with both men. When the choice came between Fort, locked up until at least March 1976, and Hairston, closer to parole, Stevens chose Hairston. The Titanic Stones came under Hairston's direction. Hairston ordered his younger brother Leroy, Lil Bull Hairston, to the streets to build support for a takeover. Fort countered by mobilizing his younger brother Benny. The factions went to open war in 1975. Lil Bull ended up in prison for crimes committed in that conflict. Fort then convinced Mickey Cogwell, one of the most respected figures in the Stone Nation, the man who had brought the Egyptian Cobras in as King Cobra Stones in 1962, to take over street leadership of the Fort faction. Once Cogwell stepped in, Hairston's street supporters began shifting. Willie Dollar Bill Bibbs, street leader of the Titanics, moved to Fort's side. The coup plan from Menard was collapsing. Hairston was paroled in 1975 with a reduced following. Shortly after release, near 70th and Paxton, a man jumped from a car and fired 8 shots. He ran to a dry cleaner on 71st and survived. The main body of the Stone Nation was now out of reach. Hairston moved to the Ida B. Wells projects. Groups that still supported him would be called Black Stones, not Black P. Stones. He operated from the margins. In late 1974, while both men were still imprisoned, Christiana Bay of the Moorish Science Temple of America visited them to introduce MSTA teachings that Black Americans descended from Asiatics and Moors, that Islam was the natural religion of Africans, and that this knowledge had been suppressed to justify slavery. Hairston refused. Fort was interested. By 1975, Fort had fully converted to Islam and was shaping a new religious identity for the organization. On March 12, 1986, Fort was released from Leavenworth. He moved to Milwaukee, convened loyalists, and shared his new teachings. In April 1976, at a meeting in Grand Boulevard, he formally disbanded the Main 21, declared the Black P. Stone name defunct, and announced the El Rukns, from the Arabic for cornerstone. Hairston was at that meeting. He argued openly that mixing religion with gangsterism was hypocritical. Turbans by day, gangsters by night. Fort ordered his death on the spot. Prince Yak intervened and pleaded for his life. Fort expelled him instead. Hairston walked out alive but permanently excluded. Fort reportedly told him that if he ever saw him again, he would end him. The El Rukns moved into narcotics distribution at a scale the Rangers had never reached. Fort banned crack outright as destructive to the Black community and enforced the ban with force while permitting and distributing heroin and cocaine. In 1979, Fort sanctioned any group still calling itself Black P. Stones. Herbert Thunder Stevens was shot dead execution style in the parking lot of a Harold's Chicken at 75th and Essex. The disciples were publicly suspected. Many blamed the El Rukns. Through the early 1980s, El Rukn hit squads systematically targeted the Titanic Stones, the last organized faction with meaningful loyalty to Hairston. The attempted massacre at a playground at 40th in Indiana in June 1981. The assassination of Barnett Hall in December 1981. The killing of Chalmers Tyler in February 1983. The botched hit on the Ewing brothers the same month. The Titanics were pushed back and depleted. Fort called them gophers. Hairston remained a person of interest to the El Rukns. There may have been plans against him, but higher priority targets intervened. In December 1983, Fort was convicted of narcotics trafficking and returned to federal prison. In November 1987, he received 80 years for conspiring with the Libyan government to commit terrorist acts on American soil. A conviction built substantially on the testimony of cooperating witness Trammell Davis, who had been paid $10,000 and threatened with charges against his wife. Contact with Libyan officials had been real. Money never transferred. No Libyan official was charged. No specific terrorism plan was produced. Fort was convicted anyway. By 1985, Titanic leader Robert Button East was incarcerated for murder. Without him, the Titanics deteriorated. Hairston, watching from the margins, became addicted to heroin, the drug he had once ordered men killed for selling. In October 1988, 75 additional years were added to Fort's sentence for ordering the 1981 murder of Willie Dollar Bill Bibbs. He would never walk free again. On September 22, 1988, jury selection for the Bibbs trial began. Hours earlier, at 12:30 a.m., Eugene Hairston was shot dead outside the Ida B. Wells homes at 3844 S. Vincennes. Police said the motive may be connected to Jeff Fort. No evidence ever conclusively linked Fort or the El Rukns to the killing. The El Rukns held a press conference proclaiming innocence. The case was never solved. Another reading is possible. A man addicted to heroin, living in public housing with no operational power, surrounded for over a decade by factions that had tried to kill him, could have been killed by many hands. The execution-style shooting with two shooters suggests planning, by whom remains unanswered. The almighty Black P. Stone Nation today has an estimated 20,000 or more members and presence in nearly every state. Most of the young men in it have never heard the name Eugene Hairston. The title of this video asks who built the Black P. Stones with Jeff Fort. The answer is Eugene Hairston. He built the organizational constitution before Fort developed an ideology. He held the title of president, appointed by the syndicates who recognized his street credibility and capacity to control men. He wrote the rules, established the Main 21, set the territorial framework, and held the organization together through its first years, while Fort, 3 years younger, operated in a secondary role early on. He spent his last decade in the Ida B. Wells projects, addicted to the drug he had once ordered men killed for selling. With a following reduced from tens of thousands to a few hundred, watching the organization he helped build operate under a name he had rejected, led by a man serving multiple life sentences. He died in the street at 12:30 in the morning. No monument, no named street, only the architecture of something enormous, built, lost, and left standing without him. Fort became a name because he stayed visible in the press, the Senate, the courts, federal indictments. Hairston became a footnote because he was removed before the story reached its most documented chapters.